Sophie adjusted her apron and sighed, leaning against the counter of Sunny Lane Café. It was a slow Tuesday afternoon, and the quiet hum of the ceiling fan seemed louder than the handful of murmured conversations scattered throughout the café. Business had been sluggish lately, which made Sophie worry about her paycheck. Every dollar mattered when you were raising a 5-year-old on your own. Her manager, Patty, was in the back taking inventory, and Sophie was glad for the lull. She needed to rest her feet after standing for hours on end. She glanced toward the corner booth where the elderly woman sat alone, staring out the window. The woman had been coming in for about 2 weeks now, always ordering the same thing, a cup of chamomile tea and a slice of lemon cake. She sat by herself, her delicate hands resting lightly on the table, her movements graceful but slow. Sophie couldn't help but notice how lonely the woman seemed. Yet there was a quiet dignity about her that intrigued her. On impulse, Sophie grabbed a fresh pot of tea and walked over to the table. "Would you like a refill, Ma?" she asked, her voice cheerful but soft. The woman looked up, her pale blue eyes sharp but kind. "Oh, thank you, dear. That's very thoughtful." Her smile was small but genuine, and Sophie felt a warmth spread through her chest. Sophie refilled the cup and lingered for a moment, unsure whether to leave or strike up a conversation. The cafe was empty enough that she had time, and there was something about the woman that drew her in. "It's been so quiet in here today," Sophie remarked. "Not that I'm complaining, of course." The woman chuckled lightly. "Well, it gives you a moment to catch your breath, doesn't it?" She tilted her head slightly, studying Sophie. "What's your name, dear?" "Sophie," she said, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "And you?" "Evelyn," the woman replied. "It's nice to meet you, Sophie." They chatted for a few minutes, their conversation flowing easily despite the difference in their ages. Evelyn spoke with an air of refinement, her words deliberate and thoughtful. Sophie learned that Evelyn was a widow and had moved to the area only recently. She seemed to enjoy the simplicity of the cafe, saying it reminded her of places she used to visit in her youth. "What about you, Sophie?" Evelyn asked, her gaze warm and attentive. "What keeps you busy when you're not here?" Sophie hesitated, not wanting to overshare, but something about Evelyn's gentle demeanor made her feel safe. "Well, I'm a single mom," she admitted. "My little boy, Max, keeps me on my toes when I'm not working here. It's a lot, but we manage." Evelyn's eyes softened. "That sounds like quite the responsibility. How old is he?" 5, Sophie said with a small smile. "He's got more energy than I know what to do with, but he's a sweet kid. Loves dinosaurs and drawing." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the door opening as a new customer walked in. Sophie excused herself to tend to the man at the counter, but she noticed Evelyn watching her as she walked away. There was something in the woman's expression, concern, perhaps, or curiosity. Over the next week, Evelyn became a regular fixture at the cafe. She came in every afternoon, always sitting at the same corner booth, and Sophie looked forward to their chats. They talked about everything from books and music to the small joys of daily life. Evelyn often asked about Max, and Sophie found herself opening up about her struggles, the long hours, the tight budget, and the constant worry about providing for her son. One evening, after the cafe had closed and Sophie was tidying up, Patty approached her. "That woman you've been talking to seems really fond of you," she remarked. "She leaves big tips every time." Sophie felt a flush of gratitude. "She's kind," she said simply. "I think she's lonely. Maybe she just likes having someone to talk to." Patty nodded. "Well, whatever the reason, it's nice to see someone appreciating you. You work so hard, Sophie." As Sophie walked home that night, the crisp autumn air nipping at her cheeks, she thought about Evelyn. The woman's presence had become a bright spot in her otherwise exhausting days. She didn't know much about Evelyn's life, but she appreciated the connection they had formed. It wasn't often that someone truly listened to her, and she felt a growing sense of comfort in their budding friendship. Sophie had no way of knowing how much Evelyn had noticed about her life or how much her kindness was about to change everything. The next week rolled around and Sophie found herself looking forward to Evelyn's visits more than she cared to admit. Evelyn's presence brought a calm warmth to the cafe, and their conversations had quickly become a highlight of Sophie's day. It wasn't just the fact that Evelyn listened, it was the way she listened, with genuine interest and without judgment. Sophie couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so seen. That Wednesday, as the morning rush wound down, Sophie noticed Evelyn at her usual booth. She was wearing a soft lavender scarf that complemented her silver hair, and she was reading a well-worn book with a ribbon marking her place. Sophie poured a fresh cup of tea and brought it over with a cheerful smile. "Good morning, Evelyn," she said, placing the cup on the table. "What's the book today?" Evelyn glanced up with a twinkle in her eye. "Oh, it's an old favorite. Pride and Prejudice. I must have read it a dozen times. But there's always something new to discover." She closed the book gently and gestured for Sophie to sit. "Take a moment, dear. I can see it's not too busy." Sophie hesitated. Technically, she wasn't supposed to sit with customers while on the clock, but the cafe was nearly empty, and Patty wouldn't mind as long as the tables were clean. Sophie slid into the seat across from Evelyn, grateful for the chance to rest her feet. They chatted about books for a while, then the conversation drifted toward family. Evelyn spoke fondly of her late husband, Arthur, who had been a kind and steady presence in her life. He was a man of quiet strength, Evelyn said with a soft smile. It's not flashy or showy, but dependable. The kind of person you could count on, no matter what. Sophie thought about how rare that kind of stability felt in her own life. She'd been on her own since Max was a baby, after his father had walked out, leaving behind little more than empty promises. It wasn't a story she shared often, but Evelyn's gentle presence made her feel safe enough to open up. "It must have been wonderful to have that kind of partnership," Sophie said, her voice wistful. "Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever find something like that." Evelyn reached across the table and placed a hand on Sophie's. Her touch was light, but the gesture was filled with warmth. "You're stronger than you realize, Sophie," she said. "Raising a child on your own is no small feat. Max is lucky to have a mother like you." Sophie felt a lump rise in her throat and quickly blinked back tears. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Sometimes it doesn't feel like enough. I'm always worried about making ends meet, about giving him the kind of life he deserves." Evelyn's expression grew thoughtful. "Do you have any help? Family nearby, perhaps?" Sophie shook her head. "Not really. My parents live out of state, and they're not in great health. Most days it's just me and Max." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the door jingling as a group of teenagers walked in, breaking the quiet spell. Sophie stood up reluctantly. "I'd better get back to work," she said. "Thanks for listening, Evelyn. It means a lot." Evelyn watched her go, her expression unreadable. That evening, as Sophie walked home with Max's small hand tucked securely in hers, she thought about her conversation with Evelyn. The older woman had a way of making her feel less alone, as though her struggles weren't insurmountable after all. "Mama, can we have pancakes for dinner?" Max asked, his wide brown eyes hopeful. "Sure, buddy," Sophie said with a smile. "We'll make them together. Okay." Their apartment was small but cozy, with mismatched furniture and crayon drawings taped to the walls. Sophie turned on some music while Max dragged a chair over to the counter to help mix the batter. For a little while, the weight of her worries lifted, replaced by the simple joy of spending time with her son. After dinner, when Max was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Sophie sat at the small kitchen table with her bills spread out in front of her. She frowned as she calculated her expenses, trying to stretch every dollar. The tips from the cafe helped, but it was never quite enough to cover everything. Rent, groceries, daycare, it all added up too quickly. As she stared at the numbers, her thoughts drifted back to Evelyn. There was something about the older woman that felt almost otherworldly, as though she'd stepped out of a different time. Sophie couldn't put her finger on it, but Evelyn's kindness seemed to radiate in a way that lingered long after their conversations ended. The next day, Evelyn came into the cafe as usual, but this time she was carrying a small bouquet of daisies. She handed them to Sophie with a smile. "I thought you could use a little brightness in your day," she said. Sophie was touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Evelyn. These are beautiful." They chatted again that afternoon, and Sophie found herself sharing more about her life than she intended. She talked about her dreams of going back to school one day, about how she wanted to give Max a better future. Evelyn listened intently, her expression warm but pensive. By the time Sophie went home that evening, she felt lighter. She couldn't explain it, but Evelyn's presence had a way of making her feel as though she wasn't carrying her burdens alone. What Sophie didn't know was that Evelyn had begun to think deeply about her young friend's struggles, and she was quietly planning a way to help. Sophie wiped her hands on her apron and glanced toward Evelyn's corner booth. She was there as usual, sipping tea and nibbling on her lemon cake, but her expression seemed far away. Sophie frowned, concerned by the older woman's uncharacteristic silence. "Evelyn, is everything all right?" Sophie asked, sliding into the seat across from her. The cafe was quiet enough that Patty wouldn't mind her taking a short break. Evelyn looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. "I'm fine, dear. Just a bit lost in thought." Sophie tilted her head, sensing there was more to it. "You know, you can tell me anything," she said gently. "You've been such a good friend to me. I want to be there for you too." Evelyn hesitated, her hands resting lightly on the edge of her teacup. Finally, she sighed. "It's nothing, really. Just reflecting on the past, I suppose. When you reach my age, you realize how much time has slipped through your fingers." Sophie nodded, giving Evelyn the space to continue if she wanted to. Eventually, Evelyn spoke again, her voice quieter. "You remind me of someone I once knew. A young woman I met long ago, full of hope but burdened by struggles. I see the same strength in you, Sophie, and I admire it." Sophie felt a lump rise in her throat. "I don't feel all that strong most days," she admitted. "I'm just doing what I have to for Max. It's hard, but he's worth it." Evelyn reached across the table and placed a hand over Sophie's. "That's precisely why you're strong. You carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, yet you never stop giving. That's a rare kind of courage." Tears pricked Sophie's eyes, but she blinked them away. "Thank you, Evelyn," she said softly. "You have no idea how much your words mean to me." Their conversation turned lighter after that, with Evelyn sharing more stories from her travels and Sophie laughing at Max's latest antics. But later that evening, as Sophie walked home, her thoughts kept returning to Evelyn's words. She wondered how someone so wise and kind could feel burdened by the passage of time. The next day, Evelyn didn't come to the cafe. Sophie tried not to worry, but as the hours ticked by, she found herself glancing toward the empty corner booth. It wasn't like Evelyn to miss her daily visit. Sophie resolved to check on her after her shift ended. That evening, Sophie rang the doorbell of the small apartment Evelyn had mentioned living in. After a moment, the door opened, and Evelyn stood there, surprised but smiling. "Sophie." "What a lovely surprise," Evelyn said, stepping aside to let her in. "I was worried when you didn't come to the cafe," Sophie explained. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right." Evelyn chuckled. "You're too kind, my dear. I'm fine, truly. I just had a bit of business to take care of today." Sophie looked around the cozy apartment, noting the neatly arranged bookshelves and framed photographs on the walls. "This is lovely," she said. "It suits you." They sat together in the living room, chatting as the evening grew darker. Eventually, Sophie's struggles spilled out her worries about money, the constant pressure to make ends meet, and her fears of not being able to provide the life Max deserved. Evelyn listened intently, her expression thoughtful. "You're doing more for Max than you realize," she said softly. "He sees your love and sacrifice every day. That's something no amount of money can replace." Sophie smiled weakly, wishing her heart felt lighter. "I just wish I could give him more. I don't want him to miss out on his childhood because I can't afford the little things." Evelyn didn't respond immediately, but there was a knowing look in her eyes. She reached for Sophie's hand, her grip warm and steady. "Sophie," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "you deserve more help than you've been given. You and Max both." Sophie looked at her in confusion. "What do you mean?" Evelyn took a deep breath. "There's something I haven't told you. I've lived a modest life in recent years, but it wasn't always that way. My husband and I built a business together, and when he passed, he left everything to me. I don't say this to boast, but to explain that I've been blessed with more than I could ever need." Sophie stared at her, stunned. "You're wealthy." Evelyn nodded. "Yes, though I rarely think of it that way. To me, wealth only has meaning when it's used to make a difference. That's why I want to help you, Sophie. You've touched my heart in ways I can't fully explain, and I feel it's time I paid that kindness forward." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes. "Evelyn, I don't know what to say. I can't accept." Evelyn held up a hand, cutting her off gently. "You've already accepted my friendship, which means more to me than you know. This is just another way for me to be your friend. Please let me do this." Reaching into a small desk drawer, Evelyn pulled out an envelope and handed it to Sophie. Inside was a check for $10,000. Sophie gasped, her hands trembling as she stared at the amount. "Evelyn, this is too much," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's exactly what you need," Evelyn said firmly. "Use it to ease your burdens, to give Max the childhood you dream of, or to chase your own dreams. I trust you to decide what's best." Overwhelmed by emotion, Sophie embraced Evelyn tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you," she murmured. "I'll never forget this." Evelyn smiled, her heart full. For the first time in years, she felt truly at peace. The walk home that evening felt surreal to Sophie. The crisp autumn air stung her cheeks, but she hardly noticed it. Clutching the envelope tightly to her chest, she kept glancing down at the check inside, half expecting it to vanish. This was the kind of thing that only happened in movies or books, not to someone like her. When she arrived at her small apartment, Max was already asleep, sprawled across his dinosaur-printed bedspread. She kissed his forehead and sat quietly at the kitchen table, staring at the check and letting the emotions of the day wash over her. Gratitude, relief, and disbelief swirled together, but underneath it all, a faint flicker of hope began to grow. For the first time in years, she could see a future that wasn't weighed down by constant worry. The next morning, Sophie hesitated before heading to the bank. What if accepting Evelyn's help made her seem ungrateful or incapable? She turned Evelyn's words over in her mind, "This is just another way for me to be your friend." That thought steadied her. Evelyn's gesture wasn't charity, it was a gift from the heart, rooted in their friendship. After depositing the money, Sophie spent the rest of the day planning carefully. She started by paying off overdue bills, electricity, rent, and the medical expense she had been putting off for months. Then, she set aside a portion of the money for Max, envisioning a brighter future for her little boy. The changes came gradually but steadily. Sophie replaced Max's worn-out shoes and bought him the dinosaur art set he'd been dreaming of, his face lighting up with pure joy when he saw it. She stocked the pantry with fresh food instead of the usual bargain staples and finally scheduled a doctor's appointment she had been avoiding for too long. But the biggest change wasn't the material improvements, it was the shift in Sophie's outlook. The constant weight on her shoulders had lessened, allowing her to focus on moments of joy rather than survival. She even found herself picking up her sketchbook more often, letting the pencil glide across the pages in the rare, quiet moments she had to herself. Evelyn continued to visit the café, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Sophie noticed a liveliness in Evelyn that hadn't been there before, as if their friendship had given her a renewed sense of purpose. They shared dreams, laughter, and even moments of silence that felt like companionship rather than emptiness. One afternoon, as the golden light of late autumn streamed through the café windows, Evelyn noticed a sketch Sophie had been working on during her break. It was a drawing of Max, his wide smile captured perfectly in a few simple lines. You're incredibly talented, Evelyn said, her voice full of admiration. Sophie smiled shyly. It's just something I do for fun. I haven't had much time for it over the years. You should pursue it, Evelyn urged. You have a gift. Perhaps you could take a class or even sell your work someday. Sophie hesitated, the idea both thrilling and terrifying. I wouldn't even know where to start, and it's hard to imagine finding the time with everything else going on. Evelyn reached across the table and placed a hand on Sophie's. You don't have to figure it all out at once. Take small steps. You've already come so far, Sophie. You're capable of more than you realize. Evelyn's encouragement planted a seed in Sophie's mind. That evening, after tucking Max into bed, she searched online for local art classes and found a weekend workshop that fit into her schedule. It was a modest start, but it felt like the beginning of something meaningful, a chance to reclaim a part of herself she had long buried. As Sophie began attending the workshop, she found herself surrounded by people who shared her passion for art. The experience reignited a spark within her, reminding her of the dreams she had once held so close. Her confidence grew with every stroke of her pencil, and she began to envision a future where her art could become more than just a hobby. Evelyn, ever the supportive friend, delighted in hearing about Sophie's progress. She would listen intently as Sophie described her projects, her eyes lighting up with pride. You found your way back to yourself, Evelyn said one day, smiling warmly. That's the greatest gift you can give to Max, to show him the strength of following your heart. Evelyn's words resonated deeply with Sophie. She realized that by pursuing her passion, she was teaching Max an important lesson about resilience and self-belief. She wanted him to grow up knowing that it was never too late to chase your dreams. As the weeks passed, the friendship between Sophie and Evelyn became a source of inspiration for both women. Evelyn, who had once felt isolated in her later years, now looked forward to each day with renewed energy. Sophie, who had spent so long simply surviving, began to truly live. Neither of them could have anticipated just how much their connection would transform their lives, but both were profoundly grateful for the chance encounter that had brought them together. Winter arrived, dusting the town in a soft blanket of snow, and the holidays brought a sense of magic that Sophie hadn't felt in years. The cafe stayed busy with customers seeking warmth and cheer, and Sophie's days were a whirlwind of serving steaming cups of cocoa and plates of gingerbread cookies. But unlike previous years, she didn't feel the weight of the season pressing down on her. For the first time in a long while, she could afford to enjoy the holidays with Max, and the joy in his face made every long shift worthwhile. Evelyn had become an inseparable part of their lives. She joined Sophie and Max for dinner one evening in their small but cozy apartment, bringing a tin of homemade shortbread cookies and a wrapped gift for Max, a beautifully illustrated book about dinosaurs. Max was thrilled, flipping through the pages and excitedly naming each species. Evelyn laughed along, her own excitement mirroring his. You've spoiled him, Sophie teased as they sat together at the table, sipping tea. Not at all, Evelyn replied with a wink. A little boy deserves to be spoiled now and then, don't you think? As they talked, Sophie couldn't help but marvel at how far they'd come. Just a few months ago, she had felt so alone, barely keeping her head above water. Now, she had not only financial stability but also a friendship that had changed her in ways she couldn't have imagined. One snowy afternoon, Evelyn invited Sophie and Max to join her for a walk through the park. They bundled up in coats and scarves, Max's small hand tucked securely in Sophie's as they strolled through the frost-covered trees. The park was alive with families building snowmen and children sledding down gentle hills, their laughter filling the crisp air. As they walked, Evelyn shared a new idea she had been mulling over. Sophie, I've been thinking about how much joy your art brings you, she said. Have you considered turning it into something more? Perhaps a small business or even an exhibit? Sophie flushed, her breath visible in the cold air. I don't know, Evelyn. I've never thought of myself as good enough for something like that. Evelyn stopped walking and turned to face her, her gaze steady. You are more than good enough, she said firmly. Your talent deserves to be shared with the world, and I want to help you make that happen. Sophie felt tears prick her eyes but blinked them away. I wouldn't even know where to start. We'll figure it out together, Evelyn said, squeezing her hand. Sometimes, all it takes is someone believing in you to help you believe in yourself. Inspired by Evelyn's encouragement, Sophie began to explore the idea. She spent her evening sketching and painting, her confidence growing with each new piece. Evelyn introduced her to a friend who owned a small gallery in town, and to Sophie's astonishment, the gallery owner agreed to feature her work in a local exhibit. The thought of her art hanging on a gallery wall felt surreal, but Evelyn's unwavering belief in her kept her grounded. The day of the exhibit arrived, and Sophie was a bundle of nerves. Evelyn stayed by her side, reassuring her with gentle words and a warm smile. When the doors opened, Sophie was overwhelmed by the response. People admired her work, offering kind words and even purchasing a few pieces. For the first time, Sophie felt like an artist, and the experience lit a fire within her to keep pursuing her passion. As the evening wound down, Max ran up to her, his cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mommy, everyone loves your drawings," he exclaimed, his smile wide and bright. Sophie knelt down and hugged him tightly. "Thank you, sweetheart. I couldn't have done it without you." Later that night, as they walked home under the glow of streetlights, Evelyn reflected on the journey they had all taken together. "You've come so far, Sophie," she said quietly. "I'm proud of you." Sophie turned to her, her heart full of gratitude. "None of this would have happened without you, Evelyn. You changed my life." Evelyn shook her head, her smile gentle. "You did this, Sophie. I may have given you a little push, but everything you've accomplished is because of your strength and determination." Sophie reached out and took Evelyn's hand, squeezing it tightly. "You're family to us now. I hope you know that." Evelyn's eyes glistened with unshed tears and she nodded. "And you're mine." The months that followed brought even more blessings. Sophie's newfound confidence and success as an artist allowed her to reduce her hours at the cafe, giving her more time to spend with Max. Evelyn continued to be a constant presence in their lives, offering wisdom and support at every turn. Together, they celebrated milestones big and small, from Sophie's first sold-out art show to Max's first day of school. In the end, Evelyn's kindness didn't just change Sophie's circumstances, it transformed her entire world. And in giving her hope, Evelyn found her own heart healed in ways she hadn't thought possible. Their lives, once marked by solitude and struggle, became a tapestry of love, friendship, and shared dreams, a reminder of the extraordinary power of simple acts of kindness.